Hello. We are back for Mental Health Monday. Feeling a lot better. Um, yeah, what's going on? So today is Mental Health Monday, part 15, and we are talking about trauma responses. But before we start, I'm going to say it once more, like I always do. I'm not a professional by any means. I'm currently in grad school working towards my master's in clinical counseling, where I will then work towards my LPC and become a professional counselor. Um, so take with everything you hear, not even if it is from a professional, take it with a grain of salt and do some research and really go with information you found. That's a very important thing. But yeah, so continuing on, we're going to talk about trauma responses today and what it can kind of do to the body, the mind, and just anything psychologically. Um, but I want to start off with a quote. I recently heard it. I think it was in a video in one of my classes or it was in a book. I don't remember exactly where, but it was in regards to trauma. It's saying that you don't go through trauma, you go through traumatic experiences. Trauma is the disconnection you have within yourself because of that traumatic experience. And I think that's a very moving and kind of telling thing when it comes to traumatic trauma and traumatic events because there does become a disconnect. And by no means am I saying you are your trauma. That is not something I'm saying. What I'm just saying is that traumatic experiences happen, and living with trauma can be very difficult, and it can be very jarring and problematic on just the body in itself. And but before we kind of start, we kind of have to think about it like in a biological way. So what happens to the brain when you're in a traumatic experience? So we talk about the fight or flight response. There's also freeze or fawn. There's a bunch of different little additions that people have added to the fight or flight, but fight or flight are the main two ones that you hear about all the time. But for the biological aspect of it, we've learned in our class by my one professor, Dr. Nicole Hall. Um, about this using the hand model and flipping the lid. So basically, when you have your thumb in your hand, and you make a fist, that's supposed to represent the brain. And this is a very good technique when working with children because a visual aspect of it will allow them to kind of understand it more and express themselves a little bit easier. But yeah, so continuing on, basically what's running in the deepest part of your brain is the amygdala and the hippocampus, and these are very important when it comes to kind of emotional regulation, emotional behavior, kind of spatial recognition, and like memory. So these are the main things. Hippocampus is mainly directed for memory, and you can remember this by saying to yourself that if you saw a hippo on campus, you would definitely remember it. That's my favorite saying, but I think that just kind of helps. So the amygdala and hippocampus run through the center, and around it, over here, we have the cerebral cortex. This is responsible for our thinking and cognition and reasoning, all the understanding and um, how we think like intuitively and whatnot. And basically, it kind of goes over. So basically, this technique talks about flipping the lid. So when we go through a traumatic experience or we go through something that's really emotion provoking, we eventually kind of lose the sense to kind of use thinking and reasoning, and we tend to act behaviorally when it comes to that fight or flight moment. So when we go through a traumatic experience, the cerebral flipping the lid is basically getting rid of your cerebral cortex, your thinking and reasoning, and you're left with your emotional behavior, your spatial recognition, your memory, everything. So basically, your instinctive kind of abilities and ideologies kick in, and then it becomes kind of what your body's going to do next. You kind of turn into that fight or flight moment. It also has to do with a lot of other aspects with what chemicals like cortisol is going through your brain. But this is just a little friendly tip to kind of help you what's going on kind of in your brain when you go through something traumatic and you kind of find yourself in that fight or flight. It is very difficult when you are in that fight or flight, when your lid is flipped, to kind of get back to thinking cognitively and think cognitively and using reasoning for certain behaviors. It is difficult, but by being aware and really thinking about this and kind of trying to recognize anytime maybe you're going through traumatic experience or when you feel yourself kind of reacting emotionally, that's what it means to when your lid is flipped. And that is just kind of something that's happening biologically and something to be aware of when you may go through traumatic experiences and these trauma responses, because your brain's going to want to protect itself. And certain ways that it can do that is by reacting emotionally with fight or flight, um, or fawn or freeze. It's your brain and your body's way of what should I do to kind of survive this, and that is basically what your body does. So anytime you hear stories about something that was clearly traumatic and you know would be traumatic to you, even if it wasn't traumatic to you and it's clearly traumatic to someone else, don't ever kind of impede what you would have done in that situation, just because um it kind of says like what they did was wrong, when in reality their brain did exactly what it needed to survive, to tell that story, to talk to you about it. And kind of just telling them what you would have done in that scenario is just not helpful. It can be very detrimental to the person, and it can kind of not re-traumatize, but it can definitely bring up a lot of emotions for that person, because basically you're just not reciprocating what they're going through. And yeah, it's just not helpful in any way. So if someone's ever telling you a traumatic story or really opening up, don't ever try to kind of say what they should have done instead, because that implies that they did something wrong, and that can just be kind of not great for your relationship either. So maybe just be conscious about this whenever you are talking to somebody about a traumatic experience, and be careful with your questioning and words, because you don't want them to kind of be re-traumatized. And that's another thing we talk about in clinical counseling. And when we are traversing traumatic experiences or trauma within the person, it is very important how we word our questions and kind of maneuver those situations, because when we're asking and talking about such a deep, significant event or experience in their life, it can be re-traumatizing. And you, as a counselor, we want to try to do it in the least problematic way, very open and safe environment, and just letting them know that we are here for them. And that's just something that I think is important too. Like, even if you're not a counselor or a mental health professional, just kind of being aware of some of these things, because I think a lot of us go through traumatic experiences, and a lot of us do have trauma, with whatever trauma it may be. And I'm not saying you should do this and ask your friends about this to kind of try to help them through their trauma. That is not, again, if you that is not the message I'm trying to relay. Last week, I talked about how to kind of go about things like with suicide ideations, just knowing your scope and what you're able to do. I'm not saying work with people through their traumas, but sometimes people will talk about their traumas with friends, loved ones, colleagues, or anyone that they have a close relationship with, because they want to kind of bond and show a vulnerability of something that they've gone through. And if you're not a mental health professional, do not even try to kind of help them or do anything with their trauma. Just because, again, like, you may end up doing more damage than good. But if someone is just relaying some traumatic experience or some trauma that they have within to you, just try to make it the most safe and accepting and understanding environment you can. That is going to be the best for your relationship. It's going to be the best for the person talking about the trauma, and it's just going to create a really healthy kind of environment for um, you and your friend or whoever you're talking to. So um, yeah, so that is a little technique we talk about. Again, it works very good with everyone, just because it's a visual key. And then what else was I going to talk about? So initial reactions when it comes to trauma, traumatic experiences, especially with adults. These tend to be kind of like exhaustion, confusion, anxiety, depression. We see that significantly with trauma or traumatic experiences and trauma responses because again, there is just certain things that your brain does, and you may not remember the traumatic experiences super clearly because again, that is your brain's and organ's way of trying to keep it safe and survive. That it's going to do what it can to kind of get rid of that memory because there's nothing good that comes from it. Um, but then this can be replaced by physiological aspects when it comes to certain triggers creating certain biosocial or um, biological reactions, such as like sweating when you smell a certain smell, um, having higher cortisol or anxiety when you see the color yellow, just a lot of different things. And it can be kind of anxiety and depression provoking because it may be reminding you of that, maybe consciously or even subconsciously. And that in itself is clearly a trauma response. And that is something that a client will have to work through. And it's very difficult in some aspects just because of how meaningful that experience may have been to them, not in a positive way, obviously, but in such a negative way, and it can really stick with people through years, and it can really have an effect on who they are, how they feel, their emotion regulation, their cognitive understanding, and just kind of a lot of things. So that is a big thing we see with all across the demographics with depression and anxiety. We see more confusion, disassociation with adults and teenagers because they just yeah, disassociating is just another way of them not having to think about certain things, not having to really focus on a few things that they may come in contact with their triggers by disassociating and not realizing what they're going through, where they're at, and kind of just going through parts of their life like that. They're able to kind of bypass any of these trauma responses or triggers. And in doing so, they kind of create this loop in their brain that whenever they go through something, they'll disassociate if they're reminded of the traumatic or trauma that they have experienced. These are very, very heavy topics to talk about, obviously, especially in the counseling field. There are many different, like, trauma focused therapies that are really um, person centered to kind of really help them through the trauma that they may be dealing with. Um, uh, yeah, so like, I mean, I didn't give a definition, but a trauma experience is any event in life that is causes a threat to our safety and potentially places our own life or lives of others at risk. Hello, everyone who is has come in and is watching. I don't know if you guys watched the beginning, but for trauma, there's this quote I really like, and I said it before, and it was we don't go through trauma, we go through traumatic events, and those traumatic events is what creates the trauma within us, which is a disconnection of to our true selves and what we are. So we are not defined by our trauma by any means, but it is something that if you are to go through a traumatic experience, it is something to work through. And many people have, and many people would benefit from working through it. But again, people deal with things in their own way. People may look against trauma or look against therapy and whatnot just because of the stigmatization around it. But that is kind of what I want this live stream to be about, just kind of talking about mental health and kind of just asking you guys to reflect on certain things and really just think and practice self-awareness when it comes to helping someone or talking to another about their traumatic experiences or yeah, just kind of thinking about your own, or if you may even have certain reactions to certain things, whether it's physically, psychologically, emotionally, um, that may stem from trauma or a traumatic experience that you may have gone through in the past. And these are just some of them. Some of the this again, this is just scratching the surface when it comes to traumatic experiences. And there's a lot more to go into this. There's so many different tangents I could go on, but I really try to keep everything kind of broad. And just like things you can kind of do to combat this. So there is a certification I'm getting currently. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma focused. So I will be certified in that, and we have to for our class, but I think it's also a good thing for counselors to have, because we're going to have clients that go through trauma. Everyone goes through traumatic experiences. Well, I shouldn't say everyone, but a, a lot of people go through traumatic experiences, and unfortunately that's the way of life. It kind of reminds me of the Jonah Hill movie, Stutz, where he talks with his therapist. And in the therapist, he said there's like three things, the three guarantees of life, and that's um, constant work, uncertainty, and pain. And pain in itself, we know to kind of be a main contributor when it comes to trauma. And again, when we have trauma responses, because the trauma, again, creates this, throws out reasoning, throws out cognitive thought, and we rely on emotional behavior to kind of combat whatever we may be going through. And it's just something that we have to be aware of. And when we go through something like that, it's very meaningful, and it can be detrimental to who we are, and it can also just affect our behaviors and decisions moving forward. And we need to be aware of that, kind of how we're behaving currently, how we may be behaving. And I mean, if you go through something traumatic, I believe we base a lot of our decisions and behaviors off past occurrences, past experiences that we have. And if someone's going through something traumatic, I think that's going to be a huge contributor into changing someone's behavior. If Because it's an experience, I'll most likely a negative one. I've never heard of a positive trauma, but um, if I believe that our experiences shape our future decisions and behaviors, I would be silly not to think that traumatic experiences would negatively affect our behavior and um, future decisions. Just because, again, and I want to make it clear that you are not your trauma. I'm not saying that, but I do believe that when people go through trauma, it tends to kind of create a, maybe even subconsciously, a certain behavior that comes out when surrounded or near this certain experience that was traumatic. If they even get close to it, they may revert to a certain behavior that that kind of they use to as a coping mechanism and defense mechanism in that aspect. So I would be silly not to think that. That's just kind of my personal thought when it comes to kind of psychoanalysis and kind of our past being a big contributor with our subconscious, conscious, and everything. But I'll get into that another time. What else was I going to say? But yeah, I mean, as clients or as counselors, we will just do our best to kind of maneuver through these traumatic experiences. There is a therapy that I really like when it comes to family therapy, and it's called internal family systems. And this is a psychoanalytical framework where you kind of dive into certain behaviors with families, and kind of look back into the past and kind of maybe explore behavior, thought process, cognitive distortion, whatever it may be, um, and explore that with something that they've gone through in their past that may be contributing to this behavior. And I really personally like it because, for the most part, you usually do find something that the client has gone through, or an event, experience, or something that the client has gone through that is in return creating this behavior in certain aspects, certain um, experiences and whatnot. And I really like this technique and therapy. I think it's very important, and I intend to kind of look more into it as I become more of a professional. Maybe even integrate it into my practice, depending on where I go in my future. Um, your boy has an interview tomorrow for possible internship, so wish me good luck. Um, but yeah, I mean, they deal with family therapy, so I'd be really in one part of that aspect. But I really like that one too because I think that it has to do, and internal family system is a good technique when it comes to trauma because you kind of go back not to revisit, but kind of just to show and see connections with experiences in their past, although they may be traumatic, kind of reflect and show that it may be affecting them in ways that they might not recognize, and in doing so, you allow them to remember and realize that they are not their trauma. So to work through this behavior would be working through that and not allowing this trauma to affect them anymore, or just in a negative way. So I think that's a very important technique. If you want to look it up, go for it. I'll probably eventually do a mental health Monday on it just because it's something I'm really interested in. And yeah, so this was just again the surface level of trauma responses. There's a lot more to go into it. There's a lot to do with trauma in this because again, a lot of people have trauma is so different for each person because not only is the trauma so different from other traumas, it is how the person who's in the traumatic event is experiencing it. And all of our experiences are different. All of our perspectives and ideologies and everything go into that as well. So, deconstructing trauma and traumatic experiences in the counseling field is very difficult, and you need to be fine tuned to certain um, perspectives and things because, again, individuals going through these these individual traumatic experiences is gonna do something different to people, and again we all react differently in some aspect or another when it comes to experiences in general. So just knowing that kind of already just creates a higher difficulty for counselors trying to maneuver through and work through the trauma with clients. But I want to thank you for everyone who came in and hopefully learned a little something today. But again, I just want to thank you for coming in and watching. I hope to see you guys in the next Mental Health Mondays. Again, they're every Monday, so come tune in. I have more videos throughout the week, so make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. I just dropped the video today. Make sure you go check that out if you're just perusing YouTube. Um, I was just down in Roanoke, Virginia for the NCAA national championship for wrestling. It was really cool. It was just a little vlog, but if you're just here for mental health, thank you for taking care of your mental health. I know it's difficult and it's really hard too, but I'm glad people are tuning in and hopefully trying to take care of their mental health. That's all I can ask. And I hope that I'm able to bring some knowledge, some information, something that may be beneficial to you. I want to end the stigma around mental health and what we're talking about. And I think that this generation and we're going in a positive direction. So I thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you're taking care of your mental health, and I will catch you guys next video.